There are 3 times as many lions in captivity as there are in the wild. That's an uncomfortable fact, but it also leads to question, where the hell are all these lions? Sure, there are zoos, there are animal sanctuaries, there are even private breeders, similar to those of Netflix fame. Then there are preservation zones. Not many people know about these. There are less than a dozen in the U.S., and most of them are used for various kinds of endangered species. There's one in Florida that is exclusively for tigers, a small one in Oklahoma used for elephants. Then there is the one in Arkansas, the Wren and Colin Pantheran Zone, the RCPZ, and they keep lions. That's where I work, and it's time we spoke about it. A lot of people haven't heard about this, and I think that is by design. The area is a lot larger than it needs to be, and most of it's wetland. When I started, there were in total about 30 lions separated into 3 prides. The lions were confined to 3 indoor shelters and a large caged outdoor space. There were veterinarians on site at every hour of the day, and a total of 45 employees on rotation. I was part of the handlers, a group of employees with the highest overturn and the least insight. This is where it gets weird. The RCPZ has literal acres of wetlands seemingly unused. It just sits there. The shelter and caged areas take up less than 1/7 of the total space. Lions aren't meant to wander around in swamps anyway, so why even have this area set up? I didn't question it too much at first. I started working there in 2016. I was part of a team of 4 handlers working with the second pride, 2 grown males, 5 females, and 6 cubs, the largest group of lions we had. I came straight out of high school, working my way up to a Ford veterinary school. I've always loved big cats, and I heard about the RCPZ completely by accident. The area has literally no online presence, and they never put out ads when they look for new people. To this day, I still have no idea if they are privately owned or not. I think it might be government owned, but I don't know. I found the RCPZ when driving through the wetlands with my buddy. We were running out of gas and desperately looking for a gas station when we found a wall along a stretch of forest. Along the wall, every 30 yards or so, was a small metal plate, describing it as the Wren and Colin Pantheran Zone. I was curious and came back the next day. I followed the wall as far as I could and happened upon a main building. I was looking for a job, and there it was. The rest is history. My interview told me that the RCPZ was off the grid for a reason. Apparently, back in the 80s, there were serious cutbacks. Since then, there's been a policy to keep non-essential costs to a minimum, so both electronics and digital equipment is more or less unheard of. The entire shelter is supposed to be able to run for at least a month, independently of the outside world with no power or internet connection. I started working after 2 weeks of training. I mostly prepared meals and helped the vets monitor the cats with more serious health conditions. One of the males was getting old, the king of the pride. In all files and folders, he was referred to as T01, so we called him Toy. Sweetest old cat you could imagine, not a violent bone in his body. He would actually purr when he saw the handlers. Sounded like someone was trying to start a lawnmower. As he got older, the vets informed us that there was nothing more we could do. It'd be a matter of weeks before he simply just couldn't walk anymore. His quality of life would drop, and he'd be in constant pain. They suggested that he be put down. This completely changed the atmosphere among the staff. I was not supposed to be part of the handlers who took Toy to his final resting place, but we had a staff shortage that day. My supervisor, Danielle, was in tears. She described to me that this was the hardest part of the job, but we all had to take solace in the fact that Toy had lived a long and carefree life. The other handlers had to coax her out of the bathroom. She locked herself in there and cried until lunch. When it was time, we barely had to do anything. Toy was so happy to see us, he willingly came along. Except we weren't going back to the vets. We walked out the back of the chain-link fence towards the wetlands. Looking at the other handlers, I knew better than to ask questions. They'd gone quiet. Toy could sense that something was wrong, and he tried his best to comfort us. He'd poke us with the tip of his nose as if to ask what was going on. We walked for at least 35 minutes, following old trails deeper into the wetlands. We had to stop at times to make sure Toy could keep up. He was losing parts of his mane by now, and he was clearly in pain. Sweet old man. Finally, we came to this big lake. I noticed there were several logs and trees around there with odd marks, as if hit by lightning or clawed by an animal. Danielle took Toy aside and asked the rest of us to start walking back. I wanted to say that we couldn't just leave her there with the lion, but no one else protested. I just looked at the others, who shook their heads. This wasn't a good time for questions. We did as we were told and walked away. Toy watched us curiously, but stayed with Danielle. As we left them behind, I looked at the other two handlers. Before I could even find the words, they interrupted me.
"Don't look,"
one of them said.
"Just accept it."
A few minutes later, the ground started rumbling. The handler said it was swamp gas, but I wasn't convinced. Swamp gas doesn't roar, and doesn't make the ground move. Also, it doesn't suddenly just stop. Does it? That day changed the way I looked at my job. I started asking a few too many questions and reading a few too many documents. For example, there are at least 6 different academic papers on the Panzera altrox going around the facility. The North American lion, they went extinct thousands of years ago. The funny thing about it is that I can't find any of those papers online, or their authors. I'm pretty sure most of them were written on site by the veterinarians. There were, of course, lots of areas I wasn't allowed in. Doors with reinforced locks and armed guards. Our ID badges were color-coded to show which corridors we were allowed to go through. Stepping out of bounds was grounds for immediate termination. The armed guards were not friendly. If anything, they could be a bit overzealous. Handlers and veterinarians were to be considered untrustworthy, so the default attitude of the guards was to doubt us and double-check our intentions. This made it hard to step out of bounds. I stayed at the RCPZ. Every time a lion would get too cold or too wounded, it would be taken into the wetlands, never to return. Only the senior handlers were allowed to go back. The rest of us were limited to the shelter and cage. Since we weren't understaffed again, I usually just watched Danielle and the other seniors lead the lion out back from afar. It happened surprisingly often, at least once every 2 months. There was an incident in October of 2018. Danielle was taking RO4, or Roy, out to the wetlands. She was gone longer than anticipated. Then the entire facility was put on lockdown. Every single armed guard got automatic weapons from the armory, and the handlers were instructed to put all the lions back in the indoor shelter. There was a siren blaring, the kind you manually hand crank. The guards made sure no one entered or left the facility, but they didn't have the manpower to see what we were doing. Most of the handlers stayed in the lunchroom, but I took the opportunity to look around. One of the veterinarians left their keys in their overcoat, making it easy for me to borrow them for a while. I started looking through the administrative area. Folder after folder of papers regarding prehistoric Ice Age creatures, mostly lions and bears. There was also a schedule post on one of the walls, where it said which lion was to be taken into the feeding ground and at what time. October of every year was marked in red ink, as if to show that it was a particularly important time. We weren't allowed cell phones on the premises, or I'd have shared it all here with you. The one thing that stood out the most was the many mentions of Tapex. At first I thought it was some kind of brand, but it was mentioned in several papers as well. The Tapex was some kind of prehistoric Ice Age creature, the true apex, that which eats lions, one paper was titled. We were locked in for the rest of the day. Danielle didn't come back. Neither did Roy. Several guards mysteriously quit on the same day. It was a mess, and no one was telling us anything about it. Senior handler Lauren was promoted to supervisor, and there were a lot of changes. The veterinarians told us that we had to triple the number of prides. 2 more enclosures were to be built, and the caged area had to be doubled in size. More lions were to be imported, And during construction, it was up to handlers to make sure they could all live in close proximity. It was hell. Imagine 4 literal alpha creatures all competing, and you are supposed to be the referee to step up when things got too rough. We had to be on 24-hour surveillance, and some of the more aggressive creatures had to be sedated regularly. Even the calmer lions were agitated by the new arrivals. We were stressed to the brim, each and every one of us. It took us months to get things in order. We managed it, but it took a lot more effort than it should have. We were just pushed too far. For weeks on end, most of us were ready to quit. Then came a pay raise, increased vacation days, and finally, the pandemic. When the COVID pandemic struck, most of us realized it would be near impossible to get another job working with animals like this. The amount of lions being put out to pasture nearly tripled. Instead of once every 2 months, it was once every 3 or 4 weeks. The veterinarians kept referencing a brood and an updated containment protocol, but we were kept in the dark about the details. They were getting careless, and the word Tapex was being thrown around more openly. Then came February 2021. I usually went home around 6 p.m. when the night crew arrived, so I was getting ready to leave. We were grooming one of the lionesses and cleaning up the shelter when the alarm went off at 5:45. The armed guards panicked. They told us we needed to bring out 3 lions immediately. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. 3 perfectly healthy lions were to be brought out and killed. The entire handler staff had to go out, and me included. The lions weren't cooperating, and we had to force them out with catch-all pulls. I was scared out of my mind. These big cats growling and snarling as we had to force them out through openings in the chain-link fence. Armed guards with itchy trigger fingers. I was keeping madness at bay with a literal stick. It was getting dark, but a few of us had brought flashlights, and I was one of them. My hands cramped around the catch-all as this massive animal protested and pulled against 4 handlers trying to hold it off. The only other light we had were the flashlights attached to the automatic weapons of the armed escort. Something was moving in the wetlands. Something big. I barely got a glimpse of it, but I saw scales. More movement, smaller. The lions were freaking out. The lioness in the far front, held back by the 5 grown and trained handlers, was jumping and rolling. It was desperately trying to get away, mewling and screaming in protest, almost snapping its own neck. The second lion, an adolescent male, was getting aggressive. The lioness we were escorting into the back just stopped, frozen in fear. She looked back at us, as if pleading for us to release her. The Tapex struck. The lioness in the front was swept along by a wave of scales, teeth, instantly sinking back into the swamp. Catch-all was dragged along, and one of the handlers who were too slow to let go was dragged into the swamp. Once he got loose, I heard nothing but a short yell before he was pulled beneath the surface. He didn't come back up. It was chaos. The handlers in front of us dropped their adolescent male who took off down the path. After about 30 feet, it just disappeared with a pained yelp. The handlers were freaking out. The armed guards were screaming at us to keep moving, to keep quiet, and turn off our flashlights. Erica, one of the handlers, just took off running back towards the shelter, and I heard a series of gunshots. For 1 second, it was completely quiet, and we were in the eye of the storm. One by one, people around me started disappearing. Some handlers took off running. Some just dived into the grass. The guards were firing at something, but I couldn't see what. In a matter of seconds, I realized I was the only one left in the catch-all for a fully grown lioness staring me down. She could have easily torn loose and mauled me, but she was just as terrified as I was. At first I thought I saw 3 logs wash up from the swamp. It took a few moments for me to realize that it was actually claws, reptilian. Something was dragging itself out of the swamp, moving big chunks of debris. It was covered in undergrowth, making it look like the wetlands themselves were moving around us. The night air was filled with wet mud. The birds had long since fled, leaving only me, the lioness, and the Tapex. I couldn't see it clearly. It had an uneven amount of eyes, all moving in different directions, vibrating with excitement larger than hubcaps. The mouth, wide enough to swallow a car. Teeth like a bison, made for crushing. It reminded me of the Cheshire Cat and locked in a sinister smile. The lioness was slowly backing away and ready to strike. I had long since dropped the catch-all and fell to my knees in surrender. There was no way to win against something like this. The Tapex looked at me, with every single eye vaguely reflecting in my abandoned flashlight. It didn't breathe. It was surprisingly quiet. Those big square teeth drew closer, only to effortlessly push me out of the way. Some sort of appendage extended from the creature's left side. I could hear several more appendages splash against the water surface. I heard the catch-all rattle closer as the lioness was pulled into the creature's maw. She put up a good fight, twisting and turning every inch of the way, but it was no use. Bones broke like twigs. Blood dripped from the space in between the bucket-sized teeth. A sudden quiet as the roars and growls of the lion stopped. I closed my eyes, barely noticing that I'd long since pissed myself. I felt the teeth drawing closer. "Please," I cried. "Please." To my surprise, it stopped. It was close enough for me to touch with the tip of my nose. The stank of mud and innards was immense, nearly making me gag. We'll bring more," I stammered. You'll get more." The Tapex retreated without hesitation. It made a sound, not a grunt or a growl or a roar. It was a calculated and trained sound made with great effort. It left, and I cried. The survivors made their way back, and it was done. They are intelligent. Long ago, we took away their natural habitat. We hunted their main prey to extinction, and at some point, we must have fought them only to realize it'd be easier to keep them happy and well-fed. They could just eat us and multiply, but as long as we keep them fed and happy, they don't. Were we to stop, they would simply leave the enclosure and wreak havoc. In a way, they are not the captives. We are. This is an apex species, just as intelligent, if not more, than we are. Those scratched marked logs I mentioned earlier? Yeah, and those were scribbles. They have a written language. They live for thousands of years and only grow larger with age. We've tried to kill them, but they're immune to pretty much everything but high-yield explosives. Their intelligence allows them to coordinate, predict attacks. Remember those cutbacks I mentioned back in the 80s? Yeah, that was after an attempt to kill one. We lost a dozen people, and they tore through 2 buildings, devouring every single line we had. The repairs cost so much that the new management decided to completely abandon the idea. I've since been promoted to supervisor, surpassing the senior handler title completely. I have to go out with every feeding now. The Tapex might get upset otherwise. They even know my name. There are 3 of them in total, 1 adolescent and 2 younger. I encountered the youngest at night. I want to reach out to those who work at the other zones. If the Tapex feeds on lions, what feeds on tigers, elephants? There is little to no contact between these zones, and the top brass are on a very strict need-to-know basis. I'm pretty sure they'd kill me if I tried going to the press, but posting anonymously online doesn't seem to bother them. Who's gonna believe some nobody on Reddit, after all?